What are the politics of the nation state? Well, first, these came in the wake of the 1848 wave of revolutionaries that stormed various cities across Europe in what was then called the Springtimes of the People. This was a great moment of hope, with nationalism, progressive politics, and the promise of the expansion of democracy as we come to know it today. Unfortunately, most of them ultimately failed. Even in France, which managed to establish a second republic, abolish slavery, and in fact, bring about what was then called the Workers' Republic. It's important to think and to remember that nationalism was indeed conceived as a progressive tool by those who were under foreign rule. If we think of the Poles who after 1830 were under Russian or Austrian rule, if we think of the Irish under British rule, but also the Czechs, Magyars, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, Romanians, Poles, and Italians, who were all under the Austrian domination of the Austrian Habsburg Empire. At the same time, nation building increasingly became a concern of already established government and rulers, especially after the failed revolutions of 1848. And this form of nation building took on a different character. It was infused with an acute concern with domesticating revolutionary ideology by forging and solidifying national identity through state power and territorial expansion. Essentially, nationalism was harnessed through the power of what became known as Realpolitik, a German name inherited from the Prussian that means realist politics. So I would encourage you to turn to your textbook to look for the definition of realpolitik and to ponder on the role of Bismarck, the Prussian leader, and Cavour, the Italian one, as those who devised and practiced and implemented realpolitik. Now, for Bismarck, who was responsible for the Franco-Prussian War, the great questions of the day, and this is a quote, will not be decided by speeches and the resolutions of a majority, a reference to the 1848 revolutions. That was the great mistake from 1848 to 1849, but by iron and blood. Iron and blood as the means through which one forges and builds a nation. And at the same time, Cavour was trying to harness and domesticate the kind of revolutionary energy brought about by men like Garibaldi. So one would pause to think about how realpolitik is a reaction to this revolutionary moment, and also what are the unintended consequences of nation building through iron and through blood. So as you have read or read through your chapter, I want you to make, or I encourage you to make a list of how war contributed to nation building and how war may have been, in fact, the most effective and preferred instrument of nation building, and what the intended and unintended consequences may have been. So in fact, one of the points I want to make is that war was no longer the result of failed diplomacy, but in fact could be an instrument for diplomacy. In the case of Russia, which was still an empire, this in fact led to a wave of reforms that your textbook details. So in fact, reforms that have to do with a three-part development. First, the emancipation of serfs. Serfdom was a remnant of feudalism, and Russia had not yet fully industrialized. So serfs are a category, a social and economic class that is bound to the land with no rights, so a form of indentured servitude. And in fact, the emancipation of the serfs was declared in 1861. Now, this emancipation went hand in hand with the program of Russification. Think of this as a program of nation building. How? The assumption that to be a nation is to essentially forge a solidarity based upon a shared language, a shared culture, and a shared past. In this case, where all three have to be invented. And part of what came with this campaign of Russification is the partial emancipation of Jews in Eastern Europe. So I want to spend some time to think about what was then termed the Jewish question and the question of Jewish emancipation. Now remember that nation building involves subjugating and restricting minorities, especially religious minorities. Why? Well, if you think of the definition of a nation, one people with a shared language, shared culture, and shared past, what does one do with those who do not fit this model? So nation building necessarily relies on the invocation, the invention of commonality, and the exclusion or subjugation of those deemed different. And this was particularly the case of Jews, the remaining religious minority in the whole of Western and Eastern Europe. And this will be the question that runs through the 19th century. And in fact, a question that both Western and Eastern European countries and nations will face. So I want to talk a little bit about Jewish life in Russia, or what was known then as the Pale of Settlement. Now, in the provinces of the Pale of Settlement, one found approximately most of the Jewish population, who formed 1/9 of the population. Now, the Pale of Settlement is essentially the name given to the territory to which Jews were restricted. They did not have freedom of travel and of residence. And this is a remnant of the aftermath of medieval Christian anti-Jewish practice. So there had been a policy of forced assimilation and expulsion carried out by Russian Tsars. Jews may enter public schools, but residence in villages was prohibited. They were also subject to forced residence and relocation. They were only allowed to settle in this particular geographical region that you identify on the screen in the map, that is the cream area. This became known as the Pale of Settlement. And in fact, Jewish men were restricted in professions and trades and were forbidden to distill or sell alcohol. Now, as the 19th century unfolded, this particular political and civil conditions created its own problems, because as the Jewish population grew in the Pale of Settlement, because of a high birth rate, better medical care, thriving communities, in fact, what you have is the confinement to the Pale of Settlement causes growing poverty. This poverty is made worse by the restrictions on professions and trades, which increase competitions among those within the Jewish communities, and in fact made even worse by forced expulsions from villages. So to give you an example, within the Pale, the number of artisans per 1,000 persons was 3 times higher than elsewhere. And although the Russian government encouraged Jews to engage in agriculture, the special settlements allotted for this purpose in southern Russia could not absorb the tens of thousands of Jewish families who were driven out of villages. And in fact, during the reign of Nicholas I in the early 19th century, the position of most Jewish families and peoples deteriorated significantly. First of all, through a practice that in fact, would be incredibly disruptive to Jewish social life. So in order to alienate Jews from their own religion, the government forced them to be conscripted into the army for a period of no less than 25 years. This took place from 1827 onwards. So Jewish communities were made responsible for supplying a required number of recruits to the army, aged between 12 and 25. If those numbers weren't met, then kidnapping would be used to fill the quota. And the children taken would be re-educated, and compulsory instruction in Christian religion and physical pressure used to induce conversion. These recruits were known as cantonists. In 29 years, in fact, after 1827, between 30,000 and 40,000 Jewish children serve as cantonists. So think about that within the context of Russification and essentially forced assimilation into Russianness in that way. Now, this situation became so bad that even government officials started considering the conditions in the Pale of Settlement to be untenable. So much so that the governor of the Kiev province, where 600,000 Jews lived, urged the government in 1861 to lift the residence restrictions in order to relieve the congestion in the Pale of Settlement. So what you have is the opening up so that you no longer have forced residence that comes along with expulsion from villages. Now, in fact, this then allows and has an impact on traditional Jewish life. Until then, typical Jewish communities in the Pale of Settlement lived outside cities in what was known as shtetls. That is, small villages, including only a few thousand inhabitants, centered around the synagogue and the marketplace. And then these communities, Jews earned their living as petty traders, middlemen, shopkeepers, peddlers, and artisans, often working in family economies with women and children as well. Of course, that thriving rural life was affected by everything I've described. At the end of the 19th century, the Jewish population in the Pale had become so impoverished that approximately 1/3 depended to some degree on Jewish welfare organizations. Now, another problem for those growing up in Jewish communities was that, in fact, Jews were allowed to enter general schools. But there, in those schools, instructions would be given in Polish, Russian, or German, never in Yiddish, the traditional form of language spoken in those Jewish communities and in shtetls. And this is what, in fact, led to the creation of Jewish schools to, in fact, counter this forced attempt that would mean a loss of culture, loss of religious practice, a loss of identity. Now, just because there was incredible poverty, we would be misguided to think that Jewish cultural life was not vibrant and did not develop. In fact, a number of important writers and intellectuals who can be considered the founders, the founding fathers of modern secular Hebrew and Yiddish literature emerged from the Pale of Settlement. It is not until the reign of Alexander II that we finally see fundamental changes for Russian society at large. As I mentioned, first we see the emancipation of serfs in 1861. And on the first anniversary of Alexander's coronation, the hated Cantonist system is repealed. And then, bit by bit, small groups of Jewish men considered useful are allowed to settle outside of the Pale. Merchants, medical doctors, artisans. And this will have important results. Jews are able to migrate and relocate. And the Jewish communities in the urban areas of St. Petersburg, Moscow, Odessa grow rapidly. And Jews begin participating in Russian and non-Jewish intellectual and cultural life. Now, the industrial development of the 1860s that follows the disastrous Crimean War also creates opportunities for a small group of Jewish entrepreneurs, particularly in banking and export trade, in mining and railroads. At the same time, the appearance of those essentially Jewish middle classes alongside Jewish lawyers, journalists, and entrepreneurs causes a sharp reaction. And what we see is the shift from a traditional form of anti-Judaism to what will become known as modern anti-Semitism. So I want you to keep in mind that, in fact, nation building and nationalism is not separate from anti-Semitism. And it is not, in fact, a transgression or a perversion of nationalism, but part of the definition of the nation is necessarily exclusionary. So anti-Semitic agitation started emerging all throughout Russia in the 1870s, with particularly new accusations. Jews were accused of forming a state within the state, and they were seen as aliens, in quotation marks, trying to dominate Russia. And this led to an increase of what we call pogroms. Pogroms essentially means spontaneous physical riots that target Jewish people and their physical belongings, and will lead to incredible violence and even deaths. Now, in practice, pogroms weren't necessarily spontaneous. They might have been encouraged and in fact condoned by local authorities. And it was a disguised mode of economic appropriation. This also sees this period the resurgence of the old myth of the blood libel, which had been outlawed by Alexander I in 1817 and is brought to life again in 1878. So what we see is the question of the emancipation of the Jews, that is a community, a religious and ethnic minority that had been until then in most of Europe considered second class, mostly because they did not have access to the same political, civil, and social and economic rights. So it changes character, just as anti-Judaism changes character and becomes a modern form of anti-Semitism. And I would encourage you to go over the question of secularization and the emergence of social Darwinism in order to see how this fuels the new anti-Semitism. So to conclude this first part, 19th century nation building could be said, and this is a quote from your textbook, to have disrupted everyday life. It brought chaos to cities, death to soldiers, and sometimes dramatic public protest. And government officials sought to offset these disturbances with new social policies intended to build national unity. These were enshrined in a middle-class ideology, and it involved first and foremost managing and disciplining these individuals or communities deemed not quite in conformity to this new bourgeois or middle-class order. The poor, workers, colonized people, women, those deemed deviants, criminals, destitutes, sex workers, or Jews. And in fact, with nation building comes the effort to maintain and recreate and uphold social order. So this was done through forms of reforms that are considered rather progressive. An emphasis on education, citizens have to be made. An emphasis on secularization, the state is no longer the monarchy, but also through the remaking of cities. And I want to talk a little bit about this particular 19th century phenomenon, because much of what people today admire in European cities, London, Berlin, or Paris, is in fact the result of an immense effort to impose social order on the city and to remake these as triumphant symbols of imperialist nation building, and middle class liberal ideology. So let me point you to the particular phenomenon of Haussmannization that takes place in Paris under Napoleon III, who, following the Franco-Prussian War, reestablishes the Second Empire in 1852, up until sort of a defeat in 1871 with the Franco-Prussian War. That was a slip of the tongue. So if you look at the photograph at the top left of your screen, what you can see is a photo of old Paris. And notice what that means. Old Paris was essentially a maze of small streets with little air, little light, where people mingles, the middle classes, the working classes, but also that would have made it very easy for revolutions and revolts to take place. Why? Think of what had been the hallmark of the springtime of the peoples in 1848. Think how easy in the small streets it would be for news to travel to announce the arrival of police or the army on horseback and to rip off these pavers and build barricades, blocking entry and protecting by inhabitants what they saw to be their own neighborhoods. And in fact, as a political and social effort, that is a hygienic effort, so where hygiene is both political and very real, what we see is Haussmannization. So this is how it was conceived. If you look at the plan on the right, notice these lines and how they are designed to cross through Paris and essentially opening up places to celebrate not just the grandeur of Paris, but also allow the policing of Paris. It not only ties together all of the most famous monuments, from the Arc de Triomphe to the left, all the way to the Louvre to the right, but also think of the ways in which this will always allow the army and the police forces to charge through. It allows for the city to become a bourgeois city. If you look at the painting below, essentially all of these old rickety buildings are destroyed, and instead what we have is that classic Haussmannian architecture. Long avenues where carriages with middle-class families could go down, fountains, large spaces, a place of middle-class leisure. And these particular buildings where, as you can see, sort of the shops, the cafes, the restaurant where these middle classes would go and socialize are at the bottom. Then one of those grandiose apartments would be on the first and second floor. And at the top would be the very small housing without running water, without electricity, for the domestic servants that would service all of these wealthy and prosperous middle-class homes. And in fact, so much so that today, these have become, in contemporary Paris, the places where students rent rooms, small, tiny places that are the only affordable spaces for impoverished young students. But at the same time as social order was imposed, social order was challenged. And this is what took place with the 1871 Commune, one of the greatest people's revolution that takes place throughout Paris. The Paris Commune that you can read about in your textbook is both a revolution and a civil war in the immediate aftermath of the 1870 Franco-Prussian Civil War and France's defeat. The Parisian people rise against their own state and government, which had not protected them. And they, in fact, demand the enactment of radical socialist and communist measures. They demand republican liberties, new systems of work, more power at the local level so people can rule themselves, essentially social revolution. They want the equality of women workers. And these same women workers ask for childcare so that they can keep working. And this was especially striking because women were on the barricades, women were speaking and giving political speeches, and women were also nurses and fighting, as you can see in this particular drawing. However, this lasted only 2 months and was brutally repressed. Another failed attempt at imagining another world. So what the 19th century is essentially that paradox of dreams of revolution and new orders and the constant return and imposition of a conservative order. And it is in this spirit that I want to turn to what opens your textbook, namely the end of this period. Giuseppe Verdi, Aida, his opera, one of the most famous maybe, Aida, performed in 1871. And I encourage you to stop this lecture and go and listen to the video, the YouTube video, to get a sense of both the music, the motif, and the performance of Aida before returning. Once you've watched the video, I would like us to think about the meaning of Aida. Now, keep in mind that opera was very popular, and it's a very specifically 19th century cultural form. Opera is really about class, power, and status. And Verdi became, in the 1840s and 60s, the preeminent composer of his days. He was also devoted to the unification of the Italian nation. So Aida is an unusual opera for Verdi, whose operas before had always managed to galvanize audiences, especially in the service of the Risorgimento, Italian unifications. Aida was also his last public and political opera. Now, in fact, what is interesting about Aida is how it came to be about. It was set in ancient Egypt. It was performed in 1871 at the Cairo Opera House. So I want us to think about Aida and how Aida is about imperial domination, but also emerges out of imperial domination. Let's think how. First of all, Verdi was asked specifically to write an opera that was for the new opera house in Cairo. How had this come about? Well, remember Cairo, which Egypt, Napoleon had tried to colonize, was in fact not an independent nation. But on November 1st, 1869, the Cairo Opera House was inaugurated. And this was a brilliant event during which the celebrations were designed for the opening of the Suez Canal, which gave Europeans access to a direct sea route to Asia in facilitating imperial conquest and imperial trade. And then for that evening, the opera Rigoletto was performed. However, 2 years later, he was asked to compose Aida, which at first was delayed because of the Franco-Prussian War. And nonetheless, it was performed finally in late 1871. So how does this opera tell us about empire? Well, let's think about it. This is an opera about ancient Egypt performed in modern Egypt, but not by, for, and to Egyptians, but by Europeans who had probably never set foot in Egypt, to Europeans celebrating their domination of Egyptian land and geography. And the opera confirmed, as Edward Said said, the Orient as an essentially exotic, distant, and antique place in which Europeans could mount a show of force. Aida, according to Edward Said, was an imperial spectacle designed to alienate and impress an almost exclusively European audience, where the Orient was presented as a place of promise and power, and where we can see how the bond between power and pleasure was central to the definition, imagination, practice, and experience of imperial rule. So to conclude, I want to finish with a definition of imperialism for you to keep in mind as we end a discussion of the nation state after this week and begin thinking about empire next week. Imperialism, for Edward Said, and this is a quote, means thinking about, settling, controlling land that you do not possess, that is distant, that is lived on, and owned by others. For all kinds of reasons, it attracts some people and often involves untold misery to others. Because if imperialism means pleasure, power, and prosperity for Europeans, for those who are colonized and become imperial subjects, it means violence, war, loss, death, and being deprived of everything that was yours, including your sense of self and subjectivity. Now, imperialism was also a political, economic, and cultural phenomenon that touched everyone's daily life in Europe. And that, in fact, is essential to the making of modern Europe. Thank you very much.